So a very warm welcome back to today's Sport for Business live webinar. This is the fourth in the series that we've done so far, and pleased to see that they've been going down well within the Sport for Business community anyway. And we're delighted to be able to do this and bring you some real understanding and real knowledge. I'm delighted this morning that I'm joined by Noel Martin, who goes by the title of Intelligence Director at Core Sponsorship. I'd always wanted to grow up to have a job title called Intelligence Director. It feels very James Bondish, but we're here this morning to learn about measurement and data, the importance of knowing what we've done, being able to see what we've done, and being able to use that in order to do things better in the future. It should be a motto for all of us to live our lives, at least in a working environment anyway. And I'm really, really pleased. I know I've seen some of the presentations so far, and I know that this is good. I know that we're going to come away from this smarter people than we go into it. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Noel, and we will be back with a Q&A at the end. Please feel free to use down at the bottom of your screen there is a Q&A button, and you'll be able to ask questions if you have them. We will come back at the end of Noel's session and do a live Q&A from the room. And Noel's session will last for about 30 minutes, and we will be back then, and we'll get you away out of the house well before 12 noon anyway. So over to you, Noel.
Thanks very much, Rob. Thanks a million for having me on today. We really appreciate it. As you said, this is actually the third session we've had with yourself. My colleague Jamie Mackin has done the previous two, and we really appreciate the opportunity to talk to the industry through yourself. Today, I want to talk about measurement and data. And this is part of a wider course that we usually give to the sponsorship industry. And I can honestly say hand on heart that every time we give this course, this particular section is the one that gets the most attention. And even when we ask for people's, I suppose, inputs before the course starts, they always say, please cover measurement. And I think luckily for you guys today, you're actually going to see much more around this particular topic than we would usually give in the course because it's so focused. So just, I suppose, the only really sales bit as such from us today is to basically say that sponsorship is one of just 9 practices in Core. And from a measurement perspective, we actually work very closely with both the data and the research practices. So we're very fortunate to work very closely with the guys. And we also work with other practices very closely throughout the group from a measurement perspective as well. In particular, the investment practice and strategy. And working within Core basically, and those practices allows us to do much, much more than we could do if we were by ourselves. So that's enough about us. This is what I like to think is a rather pensive looking elephant. We're going to return to our elephant friend at the end of our webinar as well. And I want to begin by saying that now, more than ever before, there's absolutely no limit to what we can measure in sponsorship. And our sponsorship Outlook document, which actually sits on our website, and I'd recommend it as a very good read, discusses how measurement, a good measurement fuels great activation, helps brands ignite that fan passion that we're all trying to tap into. And obviously, you can't manage what you don't measure, but we certainly don't advocate measurement for measurement's sake. That's obviously something that we would never recommend. But the important thing is that we all need to know what needs to be measured. And this is a quote that I really like from Seth Godin. He is an American author and former .com business executive. And I suppose really, like in terms of hands up in the room, which one of us would admit to doing this? So do you measure it because it's important, or is it important because it's measured? And I think a number of us are kind of guilty of doing the latter, that we find a measurement that kind of suits us, that suits our narrative, and that we continue to measure against it, as opposed to measuring what is actually really important for our sponsorship and for our business in general. And I think as well, sometimes we get attracted and we kind of fall into the trap of the big PR exposure values that we've all seen in valuations, these huge figures, which are nonsensical and which none of us can stand over and which actually seriously compromise our business. So again, the key question is really, let's find what's really important to measure. And then really, when we think about those artificially inflated valuations with huge PR exposure values, is it any wonder that we're not taken seriously at the boardroom table, particularly by our CFOs and chief execs? And this, especially at a time when we're very much in the COVID world, when sponsorship, let's face it, can be struck off at the stroke of a pen. And we've seen that really even in the last 2 to 3 weeks, speaking to sponsors and speaking to rights holders, where they basically said that sponsorship isn't the first thing that's mentioned in the boardroom, or sponsorship has been easily sacrificed as a result of what's going on. And if we don't all kind of stand up as an industry and measure what's important and have a sense of idea of the return of our sponsorship, then we won't be taken as seriously as we should be. And that's despite the fact that we believe in core that the sponsorship industry, this was our estimate, I have to say, before the COVID epidemic or pandemic, we believed that sponsorship in the industry would be 220 million this year across the island, and that would be an 8.5% increase. So the spends are going up, activation's getting better and better, there's no doubt about that. We've seen recently again how well Irish sponsors did at the European Sponsorship Awards, but we're definitely failing on the measurement side. And while there's no silver bullet, there's no one-fits-all solution here in terms of measurement, there is actually universality in sponsorship, in all sponsorship activities, because I think all of us start from the same single place, that we all want to positively influence a people or a community or a group of people or fans. I think we all start from that base. And I think it's all important that we start our measurement there. And then it's after then that measurement kind of differs on a company by company basis. So maybe for a utility company, it's about using sponsorship to reduce churn, or for a beer company, it's about helping beer sales or using sponsorship to help beer sales for a key demographic. But the universality is absolutely true. We all start from the same point in when devising our sponsorship strategies. So today I want to talk to you about 3 areas really. The first one being audience or fan impact, and that's usually delivered by primary research. It's the most widely format research used in sponsorship, and still very crucial for our business. I also want to talk about the value of rights and assets, which is incredibly important before embarking on any sponsorship activity, and especially at renewal stage as well. And finally, I want to talk about how and what else to measure, especially around data and the practical applications of data in sponsorship. But starting off with the audience impact, I believe very strongly that quality research is the absolute foundation stone for sponsorship. Research is a crucial means to measure sponsorship effectiveness. For example, measuring the depth of a sponsorship, how you influence your fans, and what all this means. And even within CORE, it's not a coincidence that I and my sponsorship colleagues actually sit right beside the research practice in CORE. And there are many different types and formats of research, and I've just highlighted a small number of them here. So I think we're all pretty familiar with the terms quantitative research and qualitative research, but you can have NatRep surveys. All our work in CORE would be based on national rep surveys of at least 1,000 adults, representative of the entire population. Focus groups have a strong role to play in sponsorship. Omnibus surveys, which are actually a cost-effective way of conducting your research. One-on-one surveys. Many rights holders do already conduct post-event surveys. They certainly have value. And then a lot of sponsors can help by conducting customer surveys. So there's a wide range of types and formats of research that we can use, irrespective of your budget and irrespective of your sponsorship strategy. And we know that brands often use brand trackers and integrate sponsorship questions. So brand trackers are often conducted on a quarterly basis, and sponsorship questions sometimes is kind of tacked on to that. But sponsorship specific research is much, much better. It's much richer. It allows us to really get to the heart or the crux of the matter as well. And these are a number of measures which we believe relate to sponsorship, because when you look at brand consideration and brand image, for example, these are all the areas that sponsorship as a tool or as a resource can contribute a lot to. So as a result, when we actually talk about sponsor-specific research, these are just a number of the areas that we can measure when we're looking at a specific piece of sponsorship. And I want to talk now briefly about an awareness, because I think awareness gets a very bad rep in our industry, particularly sponsorship awareness. But when you think about it, we actually couldn't measure anything else within sponsorship unless we start with awareness. We can't measure the passion of fans for sponsorship property, or we can't measure the goodwill generated among fans by a sponsor. But what I'm saying is sponsorship awareness shouldn't be the sole objective. It shouldn't be the outcome in our sponsorship strategies, because at the end of the day, awareness is just a memory test. It's the impact of this awareness that's important. So what I would strongly say that awareness is a very important entry point for the reasons I've given, but it does ignore the deeper impact on fans and how this translates to sponsor benefits. So I saw in a recent WARC survey that 73% of sponsorship practitioners admitted that they use generating brand awareness as being the most important objective. And that seriously limits the potential of any sponsorship that any of us could conduct. And when we created what was then Livewire and what is now Core Sponsorship, we realized that there was a serious deficit within the sponsorship industry, and especially around commercial effectiveness of sponsorship. There was really a dearth of information, or a dearth of data really in our market. So we embarked on a 3-year journey to design the most sophisticated sponsorship measurement tool. And we did, and it's called the National Sponsorship Index. And the important thing, it's entirely based on research. The National Sponsorship Index, as I said, explores the commercial impact of sponsorship and what the key levers are within sponsorship in terms of driving that commercial effectiveness. And to date, we have sampled over 4,000 people. And when we construct in terms of getting their, let's say, their awareness, gauging their awareness of particular property, or the goodwill that they've received from sponsorship, and I'll go into the tenets of sponsorship in a particular way, or in a minute, but it's entirely based on research. We wanted to, when building the National Sponsorship Index, we wanted to get the views of the fans of Ireland, of the population of Ireland, to have the most objective measure possible. So as I said, NSI is built, the National Sponsorship Index is built on 3 key tenets. The linkage levels for a particular property, so those people who made the correct link between the sponsor and the property. The levels of goodwill that are generated, both for the fan and also the property, and also the breadth and depth of fandom. And then we take those 3 key tenets of sponsorship and we see how they basically interact and deliver on the 2 commercial metrics which we have integrated within the National Sponsorship Index. That's the propensity to purchase and brand affinity. So for all of the 50+ properties in the National Sponsorship Index, we're able to see the cause and effect that fandom, goodwill, and linkage has on both propensity to purchase and brand affinity, and as a result of that, give a lot of rich data and rich insight to those people to those sponsors and rights holders who are actually on the sponsorship index. And one key measure that actually came out of the National Sponsorship Index is I suppose the potency and the value of goodwill. So for all of the properties within the National Sponsorship Index, where people were actually able to attribute linkage or the right sponsor to that particular property, we saw the commercial metrics went up by 30%. But where goodwill was seen to have been brought into sponsorship, both for the fan experience and also for the property itself, those commercial metrics went up by 71%. We would never have known that measure without actually sampling all of those people, those 4,000 people, and asking for their views and developing the index. So that's a key measurement from the National Sponsorship Index at a macro level. And in summary, in that section, I would say that research remains an absolutely critical measurement tool for understanding fan impact. If we didn't conduct research, we simply could not understand fan impact. The next section that I want to talk about, the second section, is the value of rights and assets. I think something that's a very important subject for rights holders and sponsors alike on this webinar. And let's start by saying this. I know it's very, very simple, but it's absolutely true and absolutely relevant. When you know where the value is, you can unlock and increase that valuation. And in a few moments, I'm going to show you a case study which basically demonstrates how we valued a major property within Core. But in terms of unlocking that value, for example, you might find that when we do evaluation, that perimeter boards are a key source of value, and they often are within our work. That then it gives you the insight and I suppose the ability to use those perimeter boards even better. So you refine the creative messaging within the perimeter board, and then you in turn increase that value. But you wouldn't have been able to do that if you hadn't conducted the valuation on an asset by asset basis in the first place. And the case study that I want to very briefly talk you through was a major piece of work that we did at the time on behalf of Three. They were entering into negotiations or renegotiations with Live Nation, and they wanted to get a real sense for the value of this particular property, which is arguably the biggest sponsorship property in the market. So how did we conduct this particular evaluation? Well, obviously we went through the contract and we isolated all the assets and benefits that were in there. And in this case, and it's actually typically the case for a lot of work that we do, tangible assets, which are fixed or physical assets, formed most of the rights. Formed most of the rights and benefits in the sponsorship agreement, but they also formed most of the value in this particular case. And tangible assets for this particular case study fell into two buckets. One, which are associative assets, which are assets associated with the actual property itself. So in this case, an example would be venue branding, internal and external. The best example of that is the really impactful and strong Three Arena logo that you see at the top of the building, at the front of the building, but also access to venues, bars and lounges and tickets. They were all key associative assets for this particular case study, which carried a lot of value for Three. But also then there were significant media assets. So there were media or exposure that was earned by Three, generated by Three across broadcast, digital, print, and also promoter advertising, as well as significant social and digital media. And then throughout this particular case study, we used proxies and advertising value equivalents to value some of those assets. So for example, we might, when we were looking at external branding on the Three Arena, we at the time, we would have linked that to some outdoor advertising formats to help us arrive at a value. Also, it's very important to say, and we do this in all our work, but we apply the sponsors' rates to the valuation. It's all well and good doing a valuation and combing through all of the assets and benefits. But what is really meaningful for the sponsor is that it's conducted at their values and not some just broad standard industry rate. And critically, in this case, and in all our work, the valuation is broken down by asset. So Three understood exactly how and where the value was being delivered. And that it was obviously really good information for them going into their renegotiations with Live Arena, but also give them really good insight in terms of which assets could be used best in terms of activation, for example. But there was also a major piece of work done around the intangible assets. And I know this is an area within our industry that we really struggle with. And I know also that some people use an arbitrary 80-20 sort of formula and other methods which aren't really logical, I should say, in terms of forming intangible value. When we did it for this particular case study, we looked at a number of areas in order to best form the intangible value for this particular property. So for example, we looked at primary and secondary research, we conducted a market overview, we looked at the customer profile of Three, the economic conditions at the time, and also some, I suppose, kind of future gazing into the telco market. We put all of those together through an extensive piece of work really to form what the intangible asset value is. But I think that the trap that a lot of us fall into in the industry is that we just put this arbitrary figure on it and walk away from it and hope that it's right. Intangible value needs a lot of work, it needs a lot of thought, and at best it needs a measurement framework built around it. So at the end of our valuation, which took a number of weeks, it was a very extensive piece of work, 3 came out of it with a truly robust and insightful valuation. Robust because they went through every single one of their assets. I think there were over 100 assets in the contract. And also robust in terms of it was all calculated at their value. And certainly it was a very insightful piece of work in terms of the intelligence and insight that it generated. A question that's often asked of us as well is how we can value exposure broadcast on exposure generated on broadcast and digital channels, because this is an area that I think some of us have struggled with as well in terms of trying to ascertain what the value is when we see value generated in broadcast and digital channels. And the answer to that really is by using what we do in all our work here, is using market-leading logo detection technology combined with a really robust piece of evaluation methodology. I'm going to talk more about that in the next section. And in summary, I think it's fair to say, and certainly we've proven this to ourselves throughout our own work and all the projects that we've done in core sponsorship in the past 4 to 5 years, that absolutely everything can be measured. There's absolutely no doubt about that. And the final section from me, I'm just keeping an eye on the time, so I hope I'm doing okay, is how and what to measure. And I think that's really important. And what I want to talk specifically about throughout this presentation is data and the practical application of data within sponsorship. And there's absolutely no doubt about this, that sponsors and rights holders have more access to more data than ever before. That's an absolute truth. I think sometimes we're sitting on data and we don't realize that it's data, but it's not always used consistently. It's not always leveraged properly, and certainly it's not always shared between the partners. So for example, between sponsors and rights holders. And there's a plethora of data streams there. This is just some, but it's really kind of top of head stuff. And most of us actually would have access to this or access to this through an agency or a partner. So for example, TV viewership levels, social channel data, membership data through season tickets, attendance levels that matches, customer analysis that all brands and sponsors can provide, and website traffic. So these are all very, I suppose, top of head data sources, but each of them has a story to tell. And when they're integrated properly, they give us really rich insight. And there are four applications and 4 uses of data that I want to talk about here: talent assessment, sponsor exposure measurement, econometrics, and at the end, the full share of voice picture. First of all, in terms of talent assessment, I think it's a really fascinating area that has emerged. And we know that more and more brands are increasingly partnering with influential individuals, like say talent or brand ambassadors, that they believe align with a brand image, values, and campaign. But arguably, most of that decision making around, for example, which brand ambassadors to use is around gut feel. And there's very little data, or there's very little insight information being brought to making any decisions here. An absolutely best-in-class talent selection involves instead moving to more precision-based decision-making using deep fan insight, data-led intelligence, and a bespoke selection process. So really, in terms of talent assessment, what we want to do when we're choosing which brand ambassadors to use with, and let's face it, we've more and more brand ambassadors, I suppose, to be considered, and also brand ambassadors are media channels within themselves. Even within sport, for example, there are a lot of, I suppose, ex-sport stars leaving their sport. We see them pop up on RT and News Talk, for example, and Second Captains. They're all very articulate. They all have a very good opinion, but which ones should a brand work with? And that's when we need that deep fan insight, that data-led intelligence, and a bespoke selection process. So before I show you a particular case study that I really like, if you take, for example, a GAA sponsor, maybe someone who's sponsoring the championship, when they're actually considering which brand ambassadors they should work with, for example, the hurling championship or the football championship or Camogie, for example, these are the criteria that they should consider. The social performance, so for example, in terms of social engagement for that particular athlete that they're considering, the team performance, that's the both from a social point of view, but also the performance on the pitch. There's a spider effect in terms of how this all over spills into the GA team, social media reach, GA team, volume of conversations, and last but not least, the brand fit. Because going into a sponsorship, a brand should be clear in terms of what it wants to achieve. It will want the sponsorship to convey its values. It's absolutely critical that the athlete or athletes that are chosen reflect those brand values. So this case study that I really like, because like Rob, I'm an NFL fan, is the Madden 20 game, which is an EA Sports game. So EA Sports, the client here. At Madden 20 or Madden every year is a huge game that EA launched and has massive sales. But before they launched the game, they turned to our international colleagues, this time in London, to actually help them tell them which NFL quarterback, it's always a quarterback, but which NFL quarterback should front the game. So this is the matrix that our colleagues used to actually, I suppose, come or ascertain which quarterback actually should be used in front of the game. So as you can see here, just at a glance, we're moving away from a gut feel into absolutely the proper use of data. So for all of the quarterbacks they considered, they had what they called a social performance index. So they looked at reach, engagement, growth, and audience levels for all those quarterbacks. They looked under the heading NFL relevance. They looked at the popularity and the performance of that player. Under the spider effect that I mentioned earlier, they looked at the team's reach, at the wider popularity within the NFL. And as we all know, in American sports, college is huge. So I suppose the reach that that quarterback had within their particular former college. And as I said, crucially at the end, the brand fit. You know, how well do all of these ambassadors actually reflect the, I suppose, the values and the brand for both EA Games and Madden 20. So I think it's really interesting that at the top of all of this, you had a pretty close call between Drew Brees and Patrick Mahomes. But where the actual subjectivity came in as a layer on top of all this really rich data was that Mahomes was the up-and-coming player. Drew Brees, in terms of his career arc, is pretty much at the end. So they actually chose Patrick Mahomes based in terms of the final decision based on his performance, and he was the upcoming guy, and they turned out to be right. He was MVP and won the Super Bowl within 12 months. But it was all of this data that they put in place first enabled them to make that final decision in terms of that subjective decision. And sorry, just another example of this that we really like as well. Before the last World Cup for a soccer game that came out 2 years ago, there was a big debate about whether to, the decision was almost made about using Neymar to front that game in terms of his overall reach. But again, when our colleagues actually looked at this in detail, especially in terms of engagement of fans and engagement with the athlete's content and branded content, they actually realized that Kylian Mbappe was a stronger performer. And this is before Mbappe actually lit up the World Cup in 2018. So again, that's a really good example in terms of how data was used for athlete and talent selection. I also want to talk very briefly about sponsor exposure measurement. It's a rich application of data in sponsorship, and it's something that we use quite a lot within Core. So where it comes from is that we all know that sponsors receive a range of assets associated with a sponsor event. For example, perimeter boards at a sporting event. But we also know that sponsors struggle to put a value on that exposure. And sponsor exposure measurement uses highly sophisticated AI-based exposure tracking technology to put an accurate value on that exposure. So for example, on jerseys, perimeter boards, interview backdrops, across all the AV channels. And I'll have a demonstration of this in a moment, but just to talk about, I suppose, the mechanics of it. As I said earlier, you need a robust valuation methodology. You need that market-leading logo detection technology, but you also need to have a really understanding of market values. And that goes back to what I said earlier in terms of valuations have to be done at sponsors' rates and not some generic rate card rate. So you absolutely have to know what the market would pay for this, what the sponsor would pay for this type of exposure. And in calculating it, You start with a gross advertising equivalent value using industry standards, let's say like unit population size and cost per thousands. Then you apply a range of quality criteria, 5 in all in our case, which I'll share with you in a moment, and that gives you your what we call your net or sponsor exposure quality value. So you start with a gross value, you apply a range of really rich quality criteria, and you end up with your SEQ or your net value. So it's taking a still image. This is from last year's Allianz League hurling final, and you can see that the Limerick player, Aaron Gallan, who scored an amazing goal that day, he was also man of the match. So he was interviewed by TG Carr in front of this branded backdrop. So you can see that there's extensive Allianz branding on this backdrop, and all of those kind of circles and shapes in orange, that's the logo detection technology at work. So it's isolated all of those Allianz detections. And then with that data, we apply our 5 quality criteria, because not every exposure is the same. Some exposure is absolutely high in quality, but other exposure will fail in terms of these quality criteria. So we use the duration of the actual exposure. So maybe it's up, something that's up for 10 seconds has a higher value than something that's up for 5 seconds. The size of exposure, obviously the larger the exposure, the more value it's going to carry. The location, so if it's in the center of the screen, that's going to score higher than it would if it was in the top right-hand corner. The number of times that the actual low exposure is visible on the same screen, and then whether there's any clutter, whether there's any competitor activity around that. And this is just a mock score to show that when you reduce that 100% value down to 20% value in this case. So that shows you how much exposure you can lose actually when you apply the correct quality criteria to do it properly. And then you apply that SEQ score to your gross score, and you come back to your sponsor exposure quality or SEQ value. And just some of the logo placements we can measure, as I said, into perimeter boards, interview backdrops, TV graphics, for example, branding in studio, even as minute as trophy ribbons. And when I actually did a piece of work for a major rights holder last year, I even, using this sophisticated technology, I even found a data result for a logo on a football. That's how exact it is. As the football moved through slow motion, the technology was actually able to pick it up. So now I want to show you, I suppose, kind of a demo of this at play. There's no sound to this, but it's obviously from in better days, from an Ireland New Zealand match, the famous one in the Aviva Stadium. And as Johnny lines up to kick, you will see that the technology has been trained to pick up all exposure of Vodafone. Now, what's really happening here is in the background, we're overlaying this quality criteria. So not all of this exposure will actually come through. So at the very start, you saw there was a little glimmer of the logo, and there it is again on Johnny's and Rob's shirt. Realistically, that actually wouldn't come through in terms of net value because the quality of that exposure wouldn't be high enough. So that's just a working example really of what it looks like in terms of that logo detection technology at use. I want to talk to you very briefly also about econometrics, which is a really critical and very important part of data application and sponsorship. And although economic modeling is not widely used in this market yet, we would strongly say within CORE, and I certainly agree with this, that it is the absolutely true test of sponsorship effectiveness, because econometric modeling will actually give you return on investment that you can compare with all of your other marketing strands. So that is the true test of sponsorship effectiveness, which is why we should be doing more modeling, econometric modeling in the first place, and why sponsorship should be a key part of that modeling. And it should be modeled alongside other marketing activities like above the line media, consumer promotions, PR. Sponsorship should sit alongside that. And just some relevant econometric sponsorship data streams that should be fed into sponsorship econometric modeling are sponsorship sting ratings. So for example, sponsors of the GA championship, let's say the football championship, they would get all sponsorship stings in their live broadcast. Sponsorship exposure ratings that I just showed you in terms of how to generate those, and any relevant above the line campaigns that are linked to that sponsorship. And then finally from me, guys, really is about how all of this information gives you the full share of voice picture. How do you actually use this data best? So first of all, I want to say that there's a proven correlation between share of voice in marketing and absolute share of market. There's lots of statistical research and studies to suggest that there's a very strong link between share of voice and share of market. And our media teams would always have that in mind when planning media budgets for their clients in terms of what share of voice does the client want to achieve. That does have a very strong bearing in terms of the actual spend. And as brands increasingly turn to sponsorship, both media and rights sponsorships, I appreciate that we're talking about rights mainly today, this also impacts on the share of voice levels. So now we're not just talking about above the line or media share of voice, we're talking about sponsorship share of voice as another layer. And adding that other layer of sponsorship now provides the full share of voice picture. And I think the best way to explain this is to have an example for a car company that we worked with. And they were roughly fourth. They were fourth in terms of share of voice, but they were fifth in terms of share of market. Now, fourth in terms of share of voice, I should say, when you look at TV ratings only. And they were pretty happy with that share of voice position because, as I said, it was pretty much alongside where they are in terms of share of market in fifth. However, when we went to them and we did an exhaustive review of the sponsored market for cars, we found for this car, because they were doing relatively less sponsored activity than a number of other cars, their actual share of voice fell to 10th. And what was actually happening is that those brands that now had a true share of voice ranking of, let's say, third, fourth, and fifth, they were actually beginning to eat into market share. And again, that goes back to what I just said a couple of slides ago in terms of that correlation improving link between share of voice and share of market. And on the basis of this, when they realized that their actual and real share of voice was down, they actually immediately turned to sponsorship to help them elevate their share of voice. But they would have never known their true share of voice position until we actually did that work and overlaid their sponsorship ratings on top of their media ratings. So that's pretty much it from me, guys. I wanted to come back to our pensive element. The reason why he's there, it's a pretty cool picture, is that I believe strongly that measurement in our industry is our elephant in the room. I've absolutely no doubt about that. For some reason, measurement makes us feel uncomfortable. But as I said, hopefully from what I've shown you today, I think I've shown more maybe about the how rather than the why of measurement, but hopefully from what you've seen from me, it has proven that we all have the capability and means and resource at some level to measure sponsorship effectiveness. As I said, not all of us are able to do NatRep surveys, but we can do research even at a modest level to help to prove sponsorship effectiveness and then evolve our thinking and evolve our measurement over time when we actually get to the position that we need to be. And that's it from me.
That's great, Noel. Thank you very much for your time and for your insight this morning. There's an awful lot of stuff in there to learn from, including you graciously allowing us to just sort of peel back the layers a little bit and see under the hood of what's going on. We have got a Q&A functionality now, and if you want to ask a question, rather than putting your hand up, I would ask you to just click your mouse on the Q&A button down at the bottom there, and that'll pop up, and we'll pose those questions to Noel as they come in. There's a couple of things that I've got. One is I can't understand why Tom Brady didn't feature in the NFL. You can see I've got actually a signed jersey on the back wall here of his number 12 jersey with the Patriots. But anyway, he's gone to the Buccaneers now, so farewell and good luck. Perhaps more seriously, the metrics that you use there in terms of the television ratings, we're in a world now where pay-per-view versus the mass market, sort of RTE and ITV versus potentially Sky or BT Sport. Is it factored in to that, the actual size of the audience versus the quality of the audience? In that if I was watching on RTE and I was one of a million, I might be slightly less engaged than if I was one of 100,000 that might be watching it on Sky Sports. Is there a factor in there that you work in, or?
Yeah, so first and foremost, I suppose it's kind of used at a numbers level, and we're still fortunate in this market, Rob, in terms of live sport. A lot of it, due to good work from people like RTE and Virgin Media and TG4, a lot of it is still on pay-per-view. But the data part of it will start with the actual numbers, if that makes sense. So, you know, we'll input, let's say, the 20 ratings for RTE versus maybe the 15 ratings for Virgin Media. So it starts with that. But then in terms of what you're talking about is more of a, I suppose, a qualitative measure, and then maybe we can build some research around that. But if we're talking about a data exercise, it starts with the actual number, and then we can start to interrogate that and, I suppose, add our intelligence and our thought to that.
Okay. A couple of other things that sort of came into my mind as we were going through it. You put in there the factor of a 71% uplift, I think it was, in terms of sponsorship and association with goodwill. Given the circumstances we're in at the moment, and given the fact that emotion is going to play a much bigger part, I think, in sport when it actually comes back, having been deprived of it for so long, do you think is that lift actually going to go up? Do you think that those companies who actually stick with a sponsorship might get an extra leverage out of doing so at the end of this, even if it might not work in strict business terms?
Yeah, I think it really depends down to the quality of it, the quality of the activation, really, in this case. So when we talk about goodwill, it's about how that sponsor has enhanced the fan experience, and there's obviously a number of ways of doing that. So it could be, let's say, behind the scenes content, or it's also equally important how it's benefited the actual property. And we've actually seen that sports, actually, that's an area that sports tends to struggle in terms of sports at scale, that is, actually making a very deep impression in terms of goodwill for the fan experience, especially. And often it's actually the smaller properties, the culture and music properties, that are better at generating goodwill. But to answer your question directly, it's really down to the quality of the activation and the quality of the sport. If it's seen and recognized by the fan, then it'll generate goodwill, and then it'll generate higher commercial metrics.
Okay, forest of hands shooting up in the virtual room now at the moment. One question, an important one. It's come up as anonymous on my thing, so my apologies, I can't give you credit for this. But does the property evaluation fall on the sponsor or the rights holder? Who should it be that's conducting this measurement of the partnership?
That's a good question. We've done it for both, but obviously not the same project, because that just can't be. I suppose I'd like to think, I would love to think, for example, that all rights holders would have a very good sense of the value of their sponsored property. Sometimes it happens, and sometimes it doesn't. And I think when it happens, it makes negotiations with sponsors a lot easier. On the other hand, and I've seen a number of examples of this myself, where sponsors actually go into negotiations without having a valuation, or maybe without wanting a valuation with the rights holder, and then doing it at the end when it comes to renegotiations, which could be 2 or 3 years too late. So I think the onus is absolutely on both, Rob, in terms of having that information for the rights holder in terms of being able to sell, and for the sponsor in terms of actually being able to make an informed decision. But it certainly doesn't always go that way.
So you always want to know as much, if not more, than the other person in the room, or the one across the table from you. I think that's important.
You basically want to know as much as possible. You really, really do, in terms of those negotiations. If I'm a sponsor, I actually really want to know the value of every single asset. And we all know that there are assets that are not leveraged or left behind, but at least knowing the value of them allows you to have better insight around activation and negotiations, for example.
Okay, we've got another 3 that are coming in here. Conor Doherty from Badminton Ireland. From a sporting governing body's perspective, what's the kind of membership data? What's the information that would be of value to a sponsor getting in bed with an organization, as opposed to the broadcast or the asset side of things?
Yeah, so an example of that I could give, without naming who it is. We're working with a client at the moment who's a venue owner, and they want to sell naming rights. And one of the things that will help them do that is if a sponsor or a potential sponsor would have an idea in terms of demographics of the people who turn up that stadium week in, week out. So it could be, it's very basic information in this case, but it's gender, it's obviously age and demographics. It's where they're coming from, whether it's a short distance or a long distance. within season tickets, there is quite a lot of rich information there, Connor, but it's obviously you have to have permissions in terms of being able to share that. But even that basic kind of fundamental demographic data, that's actually key for a sponsor in terms of understanding what they're working with.
Okay. Elma Byrne, hi Elma, from Pro 14 Rugby, or Guinness Pro 14 Rugby. I'll come back to Guinness at the end. For a tournament or a league which has got multiple matches on over the weekend, that technology, the logo detection stuff, would be great. It might be expensive though. Are there any? Is there a range of software products that are out there that are actually available for that? You get what you pay for, but is there that range, or is it still a fairly precise science, limited?
It is a very precise science. I think it's one of the reasons why I love it. I'm that nerd, or that type of nerd who would love something like that. I suppose to answer your question, Elmi, it is actually, I would say it's good value, first of all, in terms of the cost of it. Against other things I've seen, against other services in our industry. Also, you don't and shouldn't have to measure every single game. You should measure every single ground, and that's an absolute fact. So, for example, let's say it might be a little bit less relevant for you guys because I know a number of games are played under light, but you could have, let's say, a setting sun would affect exposure on a perimeter board in one ground versus another ground. That actually does happen and has an impact. So what you would do really is take a good sample of games that would be representative of your entire season without having to do every one. So that's a practical answer, but it's the answer that we all use. But as I would say, the actual technology, as more and more kind of providers come on board, is actually really good value.
Okay, that's great. Vicky Donlan from Leopardstown Racecourse. Hi, Vicky, and hi, Paul Mallon as well from Paddy Power. I know was in the room, and the two of you came together very well for the Paddy Power Gold Cup at Leopardstown back in the days when live sport did actually take place. Vicky, you've asked a really good question here. The importance of brand fit you mentioned earlier on, Noel. Is there a metric for actually measuring how that stacks up between a rights holder and a potential sponsor?
Yeah, it's a broad question. So I was speaking about in terms of talent assessment, make sure that athlete would be a good brand fit. I think in terms of, I'd love to be able to ask Vicky, is it talent assessment that she got in mind? If we can ask her that pretty quickly, or
we'll see if it comes in, but possibly not. Well, let's go with from just the sort of the broader brand fit sense.
Yeah. So if brand fit, absolutely, it very much applies to both the sponsor and the rights holder. So if we are talking about talent, for example, talent assessment, then for a sponsor, that sponsor needs to know absolutely that it's the right fit. I think but in a broader scale, if a sponsor is working with the rights holder, and it kind of goes back to Connor's question as well, it's kind of the type of fan that maybe a rights holder attracts, or that sports attracts, or the profile of fans that attracts. That's going to be very important for a sponsor. But I suppose, brand fit and brand values is something slightly different. But I think any sponsor getting to a partnership with rights holder and vice versa, they will want their brand values to be aligned. And we've seen a number of examples, for example, where a rights holder has said goodbye to a sponsor because the brand values actually didn't reflect theirs, and vice versa as well. So absolutely, it is important. I suppose I just had the example of talent assessment where it has a very specific role.
Okay, Vicky was saying it was the rights holder and the sponsors. I think we covered that. I'm conscious of the time. I want to get everybody away just in case you've got a 12 o'clock crashing in on top. It's funny how we've perhaps never been busier in these strange times. But we'll wrap up with a question again. I'm afraid that your name hasn't come up on it. It's just come up as an anonymous attendee, but it's a good question to finish on a session about measurement and data. What percentage of a sponsorship budget should a brand set aside for research and measurement?
That's a great question. It's a really good question. The problem is at the moment people aren't putting aside a budget against it. I don't think there's going to be a fixed answer to this. To be perfectly honest, it does very much depend on. It does very much depend, I think, on the property. the scale of that property. So for example, if you're the sponsor of keep going back to the hurling and football championship, it's something I'm missing the idea of right now, but that could be a pretty expensive measurement budget in its own right, in terms of it's a campaign that runs for four or 5 months, for example. And I don't want to give you kind of an arbitrary figure, but I think it needs to be at least 5 or 10%, I think, for starters. It might be a modest figure, but at least you start developing some insight. But I would like to see that the measurement part of the budget would grow as you go deeper and deeper. But it's a great question. The bigger problem at the moment is that people aren't putting it aside. So when I hear something that specific, it actually makes me quite happy. But I think even starting at modest levels and then building up from that.
That's great. Thank you very much, Noel, and thank you very much to everybody who has joined us. We are hopefully going to be in a position to have a recording of this up on the Sport for Business website either later on this afternoon or tomorrow morning as part of our digest. Thank you all for being here and for being here over the first 4. We're going to take a break from the webinars next week, allow everybody to actually enjoy a little bit of theoretically an Easter holiday, but the Sport for Business Digest will continue. We'll be landing out on Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday and Friday of next week. We're going to have a lot of information around the research projects that we've been doing on how we all feel about the sector and the industry as we stand at the moment as part of a tracker survey that we're going to do. So watch out for that on Tuesday. We will be kicking off the webinars and live meetings the following week as well. So please do keep in touch with us. My email is rob@sportforbusiness.com. If you've got any ideas about what you want to hear or what you want to share. It's been really wonderful having your time this morning, Noel. Thanks a million for, I know, the effort that you put into that and allowing us to see under the cover of what goes on in that sponsorship research. It used to be the days that it was always the chairman's, generally the man's prerogative, or it came down to whether a son or a daughter was playing a particular sport. I've no doubt that there is still an element of that, but obviously it is becoming much more so down to the science of it rather than the gut instinct of sponsorship now. And thanks a million for sharing that with us today. So thanks to everybody, and thanks especially to Noel.
Thank you. Happy Easter, guys. Have a lovely weekend.